Britain's jails are overflowing. More than 87,000 prisoners are currently incarcerated within their walls. For almost all of these, the aim is rehabilitation and release. But a tiny number are deemed so dangerous and depraved that they will never be freed. This extraordinary group of 45 men and 1 woman includes serial killers, torturers, hired assassins, and psychotic sadists. In some cases, the faces are familiar. Others are better known by the nicknames given to them by the press. But many of them you will never have heard of. This series will shine a light on the dark world of some of these killers. The subject of tonight's programme is a man who hacked and battered to death his victims in what were some of the most brutal murders ever seen in Britain.
For all the world, you weren't looking at someone who'd been a human being. Didn't look real. Didn't look as though it was a human being that was on that floor in that state.
It's a story of untold savagery.
All the bits and pieces that was in the corridor and the hallway, that was all his organs. He'd removed just about every organ in his body.
And a killer from whom no one was safe.
Tony was in the back of the car and his words were, "I'm going to kill that bastard." I thought, he means it, this guy.
Anthony Arkwright brought terror to the streets of South Yorkshire in a 56-hour killing spree in August 1988.
Arkwright was a savage and disturbed fantasist.
I dealt with in excess of 100 murders. Out of all of them, Arkwright was the most dangerous.
Arkwright, the middle child of 5 siblings, was born in the small mining village of Wathop-on-Dearn, near Rotherham. In 1988, Michael Burdis was a Detective Chief Inspector on the South Yorkshire Force and remembers Arkwright well.
Arkwright was a well-known petty criminal. He was distinctive. He was a very, very tall young man and just stood out in the community. He was a most dangerous man. He was cunning. He was a man who was prepared to plan what he was doing and to be devious.
Arkwright liked to impress with his spiked-up hairstyle and unusual dress sense. And he also liked to break the law.
He'd got numerous convictions for burglary, theft, arson. He'd served a 30-month youth custody sentence. He'd served a 6-month imprisonment sentence. He was well known for falling out with local people and for his fractious relationships with the neighbourhood.
He was a hustler, or tried to be. I think the first time I ever represented him would be for a relatively minor theft. But then as he got older, of course, the level of offending started to increase.
There may have been nothing remarkable about Arkwright's petty criminality, but lawyer Steve Smith did see something that disturbed him.
There was a look in the eyes that first came to my attention, first or second time that I met him.
It was a look Steve had seen before.
On one occasion I saw it in one chap who I didn't know. It was at Armley Jail and I saw him. I focused on his look and I thought, that man's a murderer. And sure enough, it was Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper.
Forensic psychologist Kerry Danes studies killers and what motivates them to commit their crimes.
Comparisons with another Yorkshireman, Peter Sutcliffe, are inevitable, I think. And I think that Arkwright would welcome them. Like Peter Sutcliffe, he had a troubled family life. He was a very unhappy child and he drifted into criminality.
His childhood had been so disturbed. He'd lived in children's homes and local authority care for most of his childhood.
The system looked after him. He was a regular.
By the time Arkwright had reached his 21st birthday, he'd swapped the children's homes for a council flat on Denman Road. The flats have recently been demolished, but back in 1988, the street looked like this. Arkwright drifted in and out of employment, mostly menial labouring jobs, but his mind was becoming fixated with murder.
Arkwright has got very lurid interests, and they clearly fuel a very potent fantasy life. He was very interested in the activities of Jack the Ripper and Peter Sutcliffe, and he even told friends that one day he was going to be as infamous and notorious as Jack the Ripper.
In 1988, Neil Hurst was a close neighbour of Arkwright.
Tony and I lived in the same block of flats on Denman Road. Tony was an oddball like that. He didn't get on with many people and he never spoke to many people, and deep down I think Tony Arkwright was a lonely lad in his own world.
Arkwright's other neighbours included Raymond Ford, a heavy drinker who lived in the flat opposite, and Marcus Law, disabled following a motorcycling accident when he was 17, who lived in the End bungalow. And Arkwright often argued with both men.
He had a few words now and again with Marcus and Raymond. I could hear him, so obviously he got a bit of trouble with them, like he won't get on with them too very well.
Arkwright could fall out with his very, very best friend as well as his very worst enemy. He was an individual who was very volatile in his relationships.
Arkwright was making enemies, and worryingly, he was also collecting weapons.
Once I went into Tony's flat and I actually saw like loads of knives, all different shapes and sizes. Flick knives and all kinds. I just felt when I saw them that I just did not need to be in Tony's flat. Yeah, that was very, very weird.
Tony Arkwright was clearly a combustible character with a fondness for weapons, but his journey towards gruesome murder would begin with a more mundane offence.
Arkwright had been involved in a burglary at Raymond Ford's flat. He stole a quite valuable antique clock and a microwave oven. Raymond Ford reported the burglary and claimed that he thought that Arkwright was the person responsible for it. The local police were fairly quickly onto it. They searched his flat, and at that time they found a couple of knives and a pocket watch. The pocket watch was particularly interesting because it had a Russian icon on the back of the watch.
The significance of the watch would become apparent later on in the investigation.
They also recovered some money, and looking round the premises they found clothes being soaked in the bath, and they were suspicious of Arkwright's whole conduct, and so they took him into custody and they had him in custody at Romarsh Police Station.
What nobody knew was that Anthony Arkwright was now no longer just a petty thief. Just hours earlier, he had embarked on a spectacularly violent killing spree. On the morning of Saturday 27th of August 1988, Anthony Arkwright was arrested on suspicion of burgling the home of his neighbour, Raymond Ford. What the police didn't know was that Arkwright had now moved into a much more dangerous level of offending. He was now a murderer. The previous evening, Arkwright had visited a nightclub with another neighbour, Neil Hurst.
On the night of the murders, me, Tony and my cousin Darren arranged to go out and we told Tony to come up to my flat. And he came up, knocked on the door. And when I opened the door, he was dressed in combat gear. We just looked at each other, me and my cousin, and realised that this was just not right. And we told him, you can't get in a nightclub like that, they'll not let you in. So we actually changed into some clothes of mine and my cousin's.
Arkwright's choice of clothes was strange, and so was his mood. When he bumped into Marcus Law, a disabled neighbour who lived nearby, there was an ominous sign of what was to come.
The only time I knew that he got a real vengeance against Marcus was on the night that we went out, and it was just before we set off in the car. Marcus came in front of my car as I was setting off. He was jokingly shouting at me, and I was telling him to get out of the way. And he was just having a laugh with me, Marcus. And then Tony said from the back of the car, "I'm going to kill that bastard." Tony said it with such adrenaline in his body that I thought, he means it, this guy.
Arkwright's behaviour was to become more erratic at the nightclub.
Tony took to the dance floor, and I've never seen anybody dance in the fashion that he did. Tony was like military dancing, if you understand, bumping into ladies like, and I knew things were going to escalate from then, that he were revving up or something.
The three men were thrown out of the club.
When the bouncer asked us to leave, we just thought it was best, and we just thought, we're in the wrong environment here, we need to get back home. We knew that everything wasn't right in his mind, it just wasn't right.
Back at Denman Road, Arkwright now turned his attention on his nearest neighbour, Raymond Ford. Ford had reported Arkwright to the police for the burglary earlier in the week, and Arkwright knew it.
Tony picked a metal bin up, and as me and Dan had entered the flats, we turned and saw Tony chuck it through Raymond's window. I just thought, what an idiot, what's he doing? Then we went up the steps, and that was end at night for us.
But the night was far from over for Tony Arkwright. Shortly afterwards, he entered the home of his opposite neighbour and killed him in the most brutal manner imaginable. But it would be some time yet before police would find the body. Another victim would be discovered first. Four hours after murdering Raymond Ford, Arkwright was arrested for the burglary of Ford's home earlier in the week. Dave Winter was one of the constables assigned to the case.
The officers who'd been interviewing Tony Arkwright that morning were telling me all about the case. They showed me these very large knives that had been recovered, but they also had a pocket watch. They were telling me that every time they mentioned this pocket watch during the interview, he got a bit nervous. He was very jittery about it. Eventually, he just told them that it was stolen from Ford. Arkwright was fully aware of all this. He knew I'd got the watch, and he always seemed very agitated.
Arkwright was bailed, and Dave Winter took him home. He was also tasked with getting a statement from Raymond Ford, but there was no sign of him, and Arkwright wasn't keen to help.
He just kept saying, look, he's not in, he's out drinking, and he did everything he could to deter me from finding Raymond Ford.
Arkwright was acting suspiciously, and neighbour Neil Hurst was about to discover why when he paid a call on Marcus Law.
After entering Marcus's door, through that door, I was shouting him. And then I went into a room and I saw Marcus disemboweled, laid on the floor. It was shocking. Tony, from what I can make out, he must have slow tortured Marcus. He'd done some bad shit to Marcus. The most horrific thing that I've ever seen. I've never been to a doctor about it, but I still have bad dreams about what I saw.
Neil was afraid he'd be implicated in the killing.
Arkwright, from the night went out, had our clothes on, and gossip does good to gossip, and they knew that I talked to Tony, and also it doesn't tell that people saw all three of us going out together that night.
Incredibly, Neil chose not to report the murder.
People have to be in that situation and understand that they needed to get away as far as they can, and people will never know, because until they've gone through it themselves, it's so hard to say what decision you're going to make.
Marcus Law's body remained undetected until Monday morning, when his mother called round to the flat and discovered the mutilated remains of her son.
It was a pretty horrendous scene. I guess very few officers had ever seen the sort of injuries that Marcus Law had suffered.
He was laid down behind his settee. His stomach had all been cut open and his crutch had been thrown through his stomach, and it was actually sticking out into the air.
Cigarettes had been placed in various orifices, particularly his nose and his mouth, and in his ears.
His head just looked like a birthday cake.
There's a lot of activity with the body after death, and we often call this kind of ritualistic behaviour a signature, because it goes above and beyond what's necessary for the commission of the crime. But it tells us a lot about what's going on in the offender's head and what their fantasy is. He clearly wanted to send a message, and that message was, I am all-powerful, and I can humiliate you. I can do whatever I want to do with you.
Marcus Law's bungalow was now a crime scene, and police had a chief suspect.
I turned to the sergeant and we both looked at each other and said, this is Tony Arkwright. So he then got on the radio and asked if anybody sees him to arrest him on suspicion of murder.
A few hours later, Arkwright was picked up by the police. He returned to Rawmarsh police station, this time as a murder suspect, and his solicitor was contacted.
The custody sergeant told me, I've got one for you. How's murder grab you?
The interview process began.
When he was taken out of the cell into the interview room, it was almost as if he preened himself. Almost as if he was looking forward to being able to be centre stage, if you like, centre of attraction.
Detective Inspector Bob Meek was assigned to interview Arkwright.
There was no direct evidence at that time to connect Arkwright. And one of the unusual aspects of the whole thing was that even at that early stage of a murder investigation, we had no true forensic evidence that pointed in anybody's particular direction.
Arkwright was a physical threat, even in the interview room.
He was 6'5". If he starts getting aggressive, it is difficult to deal with somebody of that size. But more than his demeanour or presence, it was looking at him and thinking, I think he has killed. And it's that makes an interviewing officer look at an individual as either intimidating or threatening, more than his physical presence in the room.
Arkwright denied any involvement in Marcus Law's murder.
He was not admitting that he'd done anything. He knew Marcus, he was a friend of his, etc. But at that early stage, we were a long way from even being 100% sure that he was responsible.
Arkwright seemed to enjoy the questioning.
It wasn't an interview like I've ever seen before, or since. This was a lad who toyed even with the police, as if it didn't matter. That it was just this total and complete disregard for the plight that he was in that fascinated me.
Even police interviewers are more comfortable when they can understand the person they are interviewing. Now, I never, ever understood Arkwright.
To understand Arkwright, you've really got to understand his inner world. He wants to be a famous serial killer. So here he is being interviewed for some horrific crimes. This isn't a catastrophic event as it would be for other people. This is his moment, and he's going to enjoy his moment. So he's going to play as many games as possible with the interviewing officers.
At the end of the first day of questioning, Steve Smith was asked to step outside the interview room.
The policeman, with a very stern face, says to me, "There's another body. And we believe that it's connected." And they were still counting, he said. This is how he put it. They are still counting the stab wounds.
In 1988, 21-year-old Anthony Arkwright was being interviewed at Rawmarsh Police Station in South Yorkshire on suspicion of the murder of a neighbour, Marcus Law. Meanwhile, police were trying to speak with another of Arkwright's neighbours, Raymond Ford, whose house Arkwright had burgled days earlier.
Raymond Ford had been a schoolteacher and had worked overseas, I think in Burma, for many, many years, and had contracted a rare disease and had returned to the UK and lived on a pension.
Once the murder inquiry started, we were realising that nobody had actually seen Raymond Ford and got this statement for the burglary. I was told that he's the only person on the street that has not been seen.
With concern for Ford mounting, Dave Winter once again went to his home.
When I went to the flat, the front window had been smashed, a dustbin had been thrown through the window.
Once inside the property, Dave was met with a staggering sight.
The whole room was full of cider bottles, newspapers, everything. It was well known in the area that Raymond Ford was a heavy drinker.
There were signs that someone was home.
The television was on and the heating was on. There was no lighting. So I made my way through into the corridor and there was all sorts of things on the floor and there was blood on the walls. So then I opened the bedroom door and I thought there was this pile of clothes in the corner. And when I looked behind the corner, you could see that there was a body under this. And all the bits and pieces that was in the corridor and the hallway, that was all his organs. He'd removed just about every organ in his body.
Raymond Ford had been savagely attacked. The whole of his intestines had been removed and he'd suffered about 250 stab wounds. 2 knives had been used and one of them had broken inside and the other one was left in the cavity, the body cavity, where the intestines had been. It really was a most grotesque attack.
The number of injuries and the way the body was dealt with after death is very Ripper-esque. The body was disemboweled. Now, clearly, this is Arkwright reenacting what his heroes did. It was a very well-rehearsed fantasy that he was now having the opportunity to act on.
Bob Meek was now interviewing a double murderer, and he knew he was dealing with a very disturbed individual.
In Ford's case, the injuries were quite staggering and were to some extent indicative of a level of savagery that you don't see that often. The thing that always sticks with me with Arkwright is that the injuries appeared to be inflicted in a frenzy, but there was no evidence that he had lost his temper. This was not somebody going off because of an argument or because of provocation. That this was a planned execution that he carried out.
A frenzy implies a lack of control, a blind rage, if you will. Now, that doesn't fit the picture here. This amount of injury and mutilation of a body takes a lot of time. Arkwright spent time, he indulged himself in this murder.
The level of violence Arkwright used against Raymond Ford was astonishing. And there was an even more sinister twist.
One of the witnesses told us that he'd been scared by Tony Arkwright when he visited his flat because Arkwright had been wearing a devil mask. We found this devil mask in Raymond Ford's flat, and later on, during the course of interviews, Arkwright admitted that he'd worn this mask and that he'd committed the crime whilst he was wearing his underpants so that he didn't leave any forensic traces behind.
Now that is not the action of somebody who is reacting to a brainstorm or whatever we like to call it. It's a fairly well-planned strategy.
Arkwright plays a very macabre game of dress-up. He dresses up as the devil. Now that gives us a lot of clues as to what's going on in his mind. When he fantasises, he is an all-powerful epitome of evil. Now actually, he would have looked preposterous, but to a victim, he would have looked absolutely terrifying.
Arkwright was clearly very savvy when it came to forensics, and the lack of clues was compounded by conditions inside the flat.
There were unique problems at Ford's flat. His body had been laid there for probably 48 hours. The central heating had been left on. It was extremely hot, and all the blood that we discovered there had gone sour.
Bodies that are in warm environments decompose more quickly than in colder ones. And where a body's been lying in a really warm environment with some heavy injuries, the blood essentially goes off, which means it becomes degraded or denatured and you can't analyse it as normal. In 1988, we were reliant on blood grouping and you needed large amounts of blood or other body fluid to get a result. But today we can get a full DNA profile out of absolutely tiny amounts of blood.
With forensic evidence hard to find, the police needed a lucky break, and they were about to get one. In the interview room, Arkwright was about to make an incredible revelation.
On the table was a pack of cards, and Arkwright had become familiar with the officers, picked up the cards and said, "I can read the cards. I can tell you the future."
We'd given him the cards to keep him occupied because, in fairness to him, he was being interviewed at great length.
Eventually turned over the 4 of hearts and said, "1 you've got, 2, 3, 4 to come." And of course at that stage Arkwright didn't know that we'd discovered the body of Raymond Ford, and that meant that 3 and 4 we still had to discover.
Arkwright's lawyer was called out of the interview room and told about the second murder.
But I said, "Tony, I've got something very serious to tell you about." Because earlier on, he'd treated it all as a bit of a joke. And I said, "They found another body, Tony." And he laughed. Almost as if he knew. Almost as if he'd been waiting for that moment. And then the questions would begin again. He loved it. He absolutely loved it.
This was now a double murder, and the press was soon onto it. Journalist Anne Story was a local news reporter at the time of the killings.
The Arkwright case was a mega story, probably the biggest story that we ever worked on. In all my years as a journalist, I've never ever covered anything as dramatic as this. It was just so graphic, just so unbelievable. In fact, it makes you shiver to think about it.
With 2 more bodies to find, the police set to work.
We set up a whole set of investigations to trace about 200 people who were known to be friends of Arkwright or connected with him.
The inquiry started to intensify then to identify all his family, make sure that everybody was still alive in his family.
But there was a problem. The police were running out of time with Arkwright.
We'd had him in custody for 92 hours, and we only have 96 hours before we're required to either charge or release from custody.
With just 4 hours to go before Arkwright would have to be released, police arrived at Ruskin Avenue in Mexborough and the home of Arkwright's grandfather.
Stathis Purakas lived with his housekeeper, Elsa Konradaite. They were both Lithuanian and had come as refugees following the war and lived in this particular property. It was a very smart little house, well cared for, but it appeared to be empty.
You knock on the door and there's no answer. You think, oh, well, there's something not right here. So I borrowed a neighbour's ladder and climbed in through a bedroom window that was open.
And it was quite obvious that there'd been some sort of crime there because the wardrobe had been turned out and a lot of property had been scattered around the bedroom floor.
As we were walking down the stairs,
in the kitchen we discovered the body of Elsa Konradaite. She'd been hit over the head with an axe. It was a savage wound and it clearly killed her instantly. And she'd been dead for some time.
Police had now discovered 3 bodies, but there was another still to find.
With the finding of Elsa Konradaite, we realised that the 4th victim was very likely to be the grandfather. He was nowhere to be found in the house.
One of the neighbours said, well, the granddad's got an allotment.
The allotment was on Adwick Road, a mile away from the house. Inside was yet another horrific crime scene. But what could have triggered such a barbaric murder spree?
When the police got to the shed, they were met with the most horrific sight.
In the interview room at Rawmarsh Police Station, Anthony Arkwright was playing games with the police, drip-feeding clues about his victims, 3 of whom had now been found. The search for the 4th had brought the police to an allotment owned by Arkwright's grandfather. In the shed at the bottom of the allotment, they made a gruesome discovery.
We found the body of Stathis Purakas. He'd been very, very savagely attacked. He'd been hit with an iron bar and he'd also been hit with a 14-pound sledgehammer. And his head had been very badly mutilated.
The scene was shocking, and all the more disturbing because Arkwright had done this to his own grandfather.
Well, nobody really could believe what they were doing. What have we got? What is this man? Is he a man? Is he a human being? What is it? We just didn't know what we were dealing with.
Only now did the significance of the pocket watch become apparent. It belonged to Arkwright's Lithuanian grandfather, and Arkwright had stolen it after the murder. But now it linked him to it. Police began to search for a possible motive for the killing.
There were many theories about why and what precipitated the actual acts of violence, because they were, say they were irrational is an understatement. One of the rumours that flew around at the time was that Purakas was not actually Tony's grandfather, but his father.
The police looked into the rumours, but found them to be false. But Arkwright couldn't escape the taunts.
I think Tony had a lot of difficulty when he was a kid at school because, of course, these sorts of things leak and kids are very, very cruel. And that may have created this inbuilt turmoil, this hatred of the man. And it stores itself like a cauldron until it rolls and burns over into violence. And I think in Tony's case, it created a monster.
Arkwright was a very angry young man. And it may well be that the bullying and the taunts that he had as a child were the root cause of that anger. He knows what it is to be humiliated, and I wonder whether the violent fantasies that he then developed as an adult were his way of compensating for low self-esteem, feelings of humiliation himself. I imagine that Arkwright has had a simmering hatred of his grandfather for many, many years. I think that he will have imagined killing his grandfather and thought that that would be cathartic. For whatever reason, on that day, he reached a critical threshold of rage where he couldn't resist acting on his murderous fantasies any longer.
Despite the discovery of all 4 bodies, Arkwright refused to admit anything. In fact, he revelled in the turmoil he had created.
He needed that stage because for all his life of terrible insignificance, for the first time, he was, as he saw it, somebody.
Most people, when they realise that the writing is on the wall, do admit their culpability in what is under investigation. Arkwright was extremely reluctant to do that, and it took 10 or 11 days of interviews before we got to that stage.
Eventually, however, Arkwright began to crack.
He made admissions and said, in effect, in the presence of his solicitor, I'll admit to killing Marcus Lowe.
Arkwright wasn't finished with his admissions, but he wasn't finished with his games either.
He sang a little song and asked me to name that tune, and I said, well, it's Strangers in the Night, and he told me that I got it right, and he would talk to me. Very bizarre. And at that interview, he then confessed to murdering his grandfather and Raymond Ford. And eventually, as the interviews progressed, he went on to confess almost to killing Elsa Conradite.
Almost. But Arkwright stopped short of admitting the 4th murder.
He wouldn't bring himself to say that he'd actually killed Elsa Conradite, but he did describe all the circumstances arising to, even to the fact that he was stood over her with the axe in his hand, and that he was looking at this picture of whiteness, and he himself was a picture of darkness.
I can't say I can recollect that he ever said he was sorry for anything he'd done. But I think the murder of Elsa was the thing that he might well have regretted.
I don't think that he liked himself for having killed Elsa Conradite. I think that he was sorry about that.
Arkwright took 4 lives in his killing spree, but the death toll could have been even higher.
Arkwright described approaching a man between 5 and 6 a.m. in the morning at a bus stop. He says his intention on approaching the man was to add him to his list of victims. He was going to kill him. He engaged the man in conversation and asked him for a cigarette. And the man said, yeah, if you've run out of cigarettes, I will give you a cigarette. And he gave him one. Arkwright lit the cigarette and walked off. And there is no doubt that by giving him the cigarette, that saved the man's life.
Arkwright needs to set the mood for a killing. He needs to feel personally aggrieved by a victim in order to reach that level of angry arousal, to really enjoy killing and mutilating somebody.
Neighbour Neil Hurst also had a lucky escape. On the night he murdered Raymond Ford, Arkwright also came looking for Neil.
Tony was actually knocking on my door, and I just shouted, "We're going to sleep," and he just carried on banging a couple of times, and I can remember the banging happening. I can remember the knocking, but won't answer the door, and somebody told me later it was Arkwright with a great big knife. I think to this day now, 23, 4 years on, if I'd have opened that door, I wouldn't have been here to tell this story.
The police now had 4 bodies, but there was still work to be done.
One of the main things that we needed to do at that time was to determine which order the murders had taken place in. And that actually wasn't as clear-cut as it appears.
In fact, the bodies had been discovered in the reverse order to when they had been killed. On the Friday afternoon, Arkwright killed his grandfather, then murdered Elsa Conradite shortly afterwards. Later that night, he killed Raymond Ford. and then in the early hours of Sunday morning, he took the life of Marcus Law. The killing spree lasted just 56 hours.
I wonder if killing his grandfather was not as cathartic as Arkwright expected it to be. I wonder whether it really gave him the high that he thought that he would get from it. Maybe he then needed to go out and satisfy his bloodlust further. He goes out and he takes part in murders that are far more grotesque, far more sadistic, and really indulges himself.
Arkwright was charged with 4 murders, and in June 1989, the trial began at Sheffield Crown Court.
The attention that he got from the press was incredible. Tony appeared with his spiky hair combed back and a red bow tie, I remember, and he loved it. He loved being centre stage.
Journalist Anne Story covered the trial.
He never cowered in court. He looked quite comfortable, as though he was kind of an onlooker rather than as though he didn't quite understand the trauma that he'd created.
Everyone expected the trial to be a formality.
It didn't work out like that, because when the charges were put to him, he pleaded not guilty to everything.
The case against Arkwright, however, was damning.
The evidence, I think, was fairly overwhelming. Forensically, and there were also lots of witnesses who placed him in the scene at roughly the time of the murders, etc.
Arkwright was found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The case of Elsa Conraditi, whom Arkwright never admitted to killing, was allowed to lie on file.
He was sentenced to serve a minimum of 25 years.
During the 1990s, Arkwright's case was reviewed by the Home Secretary, and his crimes were deemed so appalling that his sentence was increased to a whole life tariff.
Tony was placed on the magic list, as we call it, people who will never ever be released.
Arkwright showed no emotion when he was charged, and never gave any explanation for his actions. His mental state at the time of the killings has been much debated.
Arkwright has been described as deranged and crazy, and he's even described himself as a madman on the loose at the time that he committed the murders. But actually, according to strict psychiatric and certainly legal criteria, there really wasn't any compelling evidence to suggest that he was mad. All the evidence seemed to say that he was just bad.
A mad person isn't responsible for their actions, whereas somebody who is psychopathic is responsible for their actions, does know what they're doing, and I'm sure that Arkwright worked out and planned exactly what he did.
As to whether Arkwright should ever be released, there is much less debate.
I've no doubt that if Arkwright was ever released, he would kill again.
There would have to be enormous concern about what he might be likely to do.
If Tony was ever released, I'd feel very, very scared, not just for my life, but for other people's lives as well.
It was a drama that didn't need to be repeated.
This was a case that shocked everyone involved, and one that no one will forget.
For somebody to have the capacity to commit such grotesque acts of violence, and not only just to do it, but to savour those acts, is absolutely terrifying. To do it at the age of 21 really is off the Richter scale.
I think that he decided that now was the time to make a big statement to the world.
I don't think I've ever dealt with a case which reached the depths of such human depravity as the case of Anthony Paul Arkwright.